everyone, and welcome to the Homeschooling Global Summit. I am thrilled to introduce Tommy Schultz today. Joining us from the American Federation for Children, Tommy Schultz is the Vice President of Communications and Marketing. He is an advocate for empowering families to choose the best education for children, and he's recently been featured on Fox News, the New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, among other outlets. Tommy, welcome. We are so excited to have you here today.
Hey, look, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So let's get started. And I would like to explain to everyone, what is the American Federation for Children and why was it all started?
Sure. So about 30 years ago, there were a number of folks who were really concerned about the state of our education system here in the United States, to where they looked across our K through 12 public schools and said, look, there are a shocking number of students, particularly lower income students, who are not getting the benefit of a good education, let alone a great education. And we really need to change that. And many of these folks were philanthropists who are trying to help lower income children get access to a great school, either by starting their own scholarship foundations, but they sort of realized that while they were helping many children in this regard, systemically, they weren't fixing things. And so they made this effort to say, we need to put our resources, our time, our energy, our grassroots supporters into a mechanism that says, let's give more families the freedom to choose the best education for their children. And so you had this movement in the early 90s that came about, where you had charter schools develop, you had the first private school voucher programs getting passed at the state level. And then since that time, our organization essentially conglomerated many other education reform organizations, to where we became the American Federation for Children about 10 years ago. And we are the largest school choice advocacy organization. So as you mentioned earlier, we are all dedicated to empowering families with the freedom to choose the best education for their children, particularly lower income families, because as we say very often, I mean, if you have the financial means, you have school choice, right? You can choose to move to a better school district. You can pay for private school tuition, but if you can't afford those things, if you can't just suddenly up and move and get out of your zip code, you're somewhat stuck, and you're basically hoping that you hit the lottery, and you're hoping that your children are in the right school for them. And we've even discovered beyond that too, as anybody who has children knows. I mean, one school for one of your kids might be great, and for this other one, that same school might not be the best one. And so there really needs to be this new model within education that has to open up and really be customized to the individual needs of kids. And the only way to really do that is to give families that freedom, to allow them to choose the best educational environment. I mean, it might be beyond brick and mortar, as we're probably going to talk about a lot today with your work as well. But for us, fundamentally, it does come down to almost an issue of justice, right? To where we essentially have a two-tiered system within our country's education model, where if you have financial means, you're likely your kids are going to be okay within this current model. But even still, the statistics are showing that, I mean, gosh, 65% of kids aren't proficient in reading. And, we hear these tropes about, well, we can't entertain these other models because, kids might not be learning history or civics, because public schools in our country are the bedrock of civil society. Well, I looked at the data this morning, and it said, 4 years ago, 18% of kids were proficient in, history, and now it's 15%. So we're on a steady decline, and I mean, it's abysmal as it is. So much of our education system really needs to be rethought, invigorated, and I'm hopeful that at this moment, when so many families are forced to stay at home, everything that we've been saying for 30 years can really start to bear out in the upcoming decade here, because it's so important for these lower income families. And that's at the heart of our movement. And that's why we started. We said, look, not only do we want to give every family the freedom to choose the best education for their son or daughter, we particularly want to help lower income families. So that's the background.
Well, that's really interesting. And it sounds like, with those numbers that are quite scary, as an educator myself, that there is a lot of hope coming forward. So can we talk about what is the impact been from COVID-19 on the American Federation for Children?
Sure. So we have a model where we get engaged in elections and then in legislative advocacy and then also in grassroots development and general advocacy for school choice policies. And it's been tricky this year because so many legislatures have essentially gone on pause for about 4 or 5 months. So that rejiggered things. But at the same time, many legislatures went into emergency sessions, and even in the federal government, there's been efforts to figure out ways to provide relief or new opportunities for families during this incredible time. Because in March, I mean, you had maybe in the United States, 4 to 5% of families actually engage in some sort of homeschooling or home education environment. And, within weeks that went to 100%. And then it wasn't even really, you can't even really characterize it as homeschooling because it's a super restrictive environment where you're either quarantined into your home, you're doing this sort of Zoom schooling thing. And even for so many public school districts across the country, the data is showing that many of them didn't even attempt to do that, which is a real shame. And it's really, we're scared to see what might come about from that with particularly lower income families that might not have had access to internet. They're not getting check-ins from their teachers. Many schools completely abandoned their standardized tests. So, I mean, there might be a huge learning loss, but we're just not aware of it. So you can't really track what's falling behind. So all of these things that sort of happened that really changed how we started to think about, okay, what do we need to tackle here to, pass laws or give families more opportunities? What can we do and what options can we give to governors? What federal mechanisms can be made available to legislatures and governors and state education agencies to provide either some new mechanisms for, families, whether that's, funds for, let's say, home education options like, hey, do you need to have, just a laptop or do you need a Wi-Fi hotspot? Do you need tutoring or sort of special needs therapies options? I mean, all these things that were either given from the feds with micro grants or governor's emergency education relief funds, all these things that we've been just trying to work with both the administration at the federal level, the Department of Education at the federal level, and state departments of education, and with legislatures and governors to say, look, families are in many ways in crisis in this moment. We can provide them opportunities and educational flexibility just by being smart about it. And now we're thinking too, it's, the impact of this going into the fall, what happens if, like, with so many school districts where they just ended in March for their school year, what happens if that continues through the fall? There was a lot of hope that things would be reopened by, August, September for many of these brick and mortar schools, but that's not a certainty. And so we did a poll back in April that showed at that time that 40% of families were more likely to homeschool their child once things do open up. And many folks said, hey, that's crazy. That's, those numbers are inflated. Families don't really feel that. And I said, well, I mean, this is the data from a nationwide survey of parents. So, I'm just taking that at face value. 2 weeks later, a separate organization published with USA Today did a poll and it said 60% of families were more likely to homeschool after things opened up. And so for me, it shows the longer and longer that this is going on, the more and more eager families are to really take advantage of potential home education options. And so again, back to, what are we doing to adjust or to, think through the implications of this global pandemic? We are really starting to think more and more about what are the educational options that we can either pass legislatively to give families more opportunities. What can we be doing in terms of our parent networks and our kind of grassroots opportunities to really provide families, resources or guidance or options. All these things have really, just upended much of our normal operations. But I think in some ways too, it's exactly what we've been saying for decades, really, is that families need more flexibility and options and opportunities when it comes to K through 12, because a factory style system from Prussia in the 1800s that just puts everybody into a brick and mortar situation, nice little neat rows, and it's just largely unchanged for, generations. That we already knew that wasn't working, but now that families have really been in this totally new environment forced upon them, I think they're starting to see that too.
Yeah, that's crazy. And that's so interesting that, this is actually kind of the gentle, not gentle, but the forceful push that everyone needed for this change. So I want to talk a little bit about the funding and what's going to happen to this money and how can families, find their way without this funding for themselves.
Well, right. I mean, we've heard from so many families, that they've just been frustrated with their school systems and how their districts might have reacted to this. I mean, so many of them either did a full stop for many weeks and then didn't even attempt to do any sort of remote learning, any sort of remote check-in, which was, I mean, incredibly, stressful for so many families because they might have been told that they would be shifting to this, or they might be seeing that other schools, whether they are private or even public charter schools, they were reacting quickly, partly because they knew, their families could leave at any moment, right? So they have to serve that family over, and go above and beyond in terms of, traditional customer service. Whereas the public school districts can largely rely upon, funding streams from the tax base. Their families, again, unless they can afford to move or they can pull their kids out and pay for either tuition or find some other option, their kids are just going to keep coming back. And so with all of that anxiety, providing pressure, and with us putting out information to families, and as we've been doing for, decades, saying, where is the money going? Some of the most engaged graphics or videos that we've put out over the past few months showing how, look, on average, the federal data says we are spending $15,424 per student in K through 12 in the United States. Every family looks at that and goes, wait a minute, I am completely, in charge of my kids' education right now here at home. We put out petitions saying, wouldn't you like to get some of that money back to use for whether it's, digital, courses or other sort of, online curriculum, tutors, therapies, et cetera. That has become a much more popular idea. And we've actually, on these petitions that we put out like this saying, hey, look, wouldn't you like to fund your own child, right? With your own tax dollars going to your child, wouldn't you like some of that money back to, help provide resources for you at home? And I mean, we've collected more than 450,000 emails and phone numbers on this campaign. So clearly, I mean, something has really struck a nerve with families across the country. And for us, we see this again as an opportunity to say, this is what we've been talking about for so many years, that the funding should follow your child. The dollar should follow the scholar, as I like to say. And in so many ways, these school choice programs that we pass at the state level operate in that way, where we say, look, a portion of the state funding goes to the child that they can say, I want to use this for tuition, or in some programs, I want to use this for a host of approved education expenses. So I think that model is going to be dramatically more popular for families. So many of them, as we're seeing in other surveys too, are loving the home education environment. And we think it's just a bit unfair that, so much money is going, into the general float of the school district, and vast majority of them aren't even providing learning right now. And so much too of the growth of that, right? I mean, we've looked at statistics from there's great organizations putting out the exact kind of allocation of where that's going, and there's been like a 300% increase in non-teaching staff and administrative bloat since the 1970s that has really been just sucking up so much of this money. Because if you're a teacher, right, your salary. And if you do the math and you're looking at, well, about 15,000 per kid, and I've got 20 kids in the classroom, you're looking at that number going like, wait a minute, where is the money going? Because it's clearly not going to me. And again, it's less of an issue of a total appropriation. It's an issue of allocation, right? And so we believe that, sure, teachers should be getting paid more, especially the great ones. And we also believe that families should be able to choose where they want to go with that. And I think you're just going to see, again, with all of these dynamics going on with COVID, so many more families demanding, newer educational opportunities, demanding a better delivery of the product in their brick and mortar schools. And I think just a real openness to, home education. And I think teachers too are going to start looking and saying, wait, maybe I can be, some sort of a tutor for, maybe a few dozen homeschooling families. I think all these things are finally on the table, as you said, due to that soft, or rather, maybe hard nudge from the global pandemic.
Wow, that's quite scary. And I think it's interesting that the polls are showing 40% and 60%. And how has this experience helped people see the light or see the difference in the education that they're receiving? So do parents feel that they can continue this at home?
I think they do. There's certainly going to be a segment of the population where this is not realistic for them, obviously, and we don't think that, as we've said, even with all the public school system as it is, this sort of one size fits all is really one size fits none, right? And so we think there's going to be slivers that are saying, I want a brick and mortar private school, I want to go to a public charter school, I want to do some, blended home environment, I want to do a full-on home environment. I think there's all these options should be made available to families, and especially if we're spending $850 billion per year when it comes to state, local, and federal tax dollars. I mean, that's as much as our Defense Department. We should be getting a little bit better results than the vast majority of kids can't do reading and math at grade level. And so I think as we're looking to the future here, I think so many families are going to start to approach home education much more aggressively. I think they're going to say and demand from their lawmakers and demand from policymakers that, look, we need to be provided more options and opportunities for home education. As we've learned that, look, especially with families that have special needs students that may have a whole lot of anxiety and stress of, when going to, a brick and mortar setting, or we've heard pretty significantly from families whose kids who might be bullied. I mean, this is a huge issue in public schools to where I think even federal data shows that, 21% of kids, 1 in 5 are saying that they've been bullied in their public school. That's a crisis in and of itself, and to where they know they're safe at home and they aren't feeling, the anxiety of what, the social dynamics going on in public schools. I think that's been a real treasure for so many families, or so many of them are finding that they're reconnecting with their kids and actually getting to spend really quality time with them. I think all these kind of pockets and slivers of the population that are going through this new education environment are realizing something has to change, right? At the fundamental level to all of this. So I think that's kind of what the future looks like here as we're going into the, going into the fall, going into 2021.
Wow, that's incredible. And I think that it does give some relief to those students who weren't necessarily settled in well to the brick and mortar. But I'm also interested to see when schools do reopen, how will the impact of COVID change the traditional system, and what kind of force do you see coming from educators and from parents for the future?
Yeah, I think it really is going to be some potential dynamics, yet to be seen that force upon this political system some real change, right? Because we have to acknowledge that everything about K through 12 education really does start at the political level, to where policies that were passed generations ago, whether it's the arbitrary red line around your zip code or your neighborhood, or, from the school board level to the state legislature level, they control the mechanisms that, dictate so much of our education system. And so that's where we've been working at the state legislature level, especially to pass these policies that allow families to have more freedom and opportunity. And I think, with so many public school districts relying upon, the head count of the number of kids in seats for kind of their funding formulas, as we were talking about earlier, what does that look like if, let's say on our poll, maybe 40% of families don't show up in the fall because they're saying, look, we're not doing this old school kind of model, we're pursuing home education. That might screw up some funding formulas. Two, so many families, let's say they do re-enroll their kids into public school, they see virtually no changes, or let's say even more, dramatically, they're going back to school, but in this super restrictive environment with, plexiglass little prisons around their desks, and young children have to wear face masks for the full 8 hours of the day. I mean, we've been seeing this in our surveys that that's a real thing that families are really concerned about and are not eager to really jump into. If that happens, I mean, that is going to provide an unbelievable amount of political pressure on lawmakers and policymakers to make some changes, because again, if the majority or even a huge, plurality of families aren't going to school or refuse to, engage in that, 2019 and early 2020 learning environment, I don't think any of these, whether it's local school boards, I think there's 13,000 different school boards across the country, or state legislatures, across the 50 states, they're going to be looking at this saying, this doesn't make sense in terms of the old funding models that we might have had, or in the old operational models that we had. We have to change it. However, again, going back to the politics, the two largest, unions in the country, the teachers unions, both the American Federation of Teachers and National Education Association, which, they have actually a huge proportion of their membership that they aren't actually teachers, right? And it goes back to that administrator issue. Many of them even have like grad students as part of their union, but they just want more money and more members to, pay them dues forcibly. They want to have them, take that right out of their paychecks. So much of the resistance in these changes comes from the unions, right? They want to make sure that everything stays the same. They want to be in control of this. 82% of kids in the country go to a district controlled public school. They want to keep that as high as possible. They don't want families to have the freedom to choose the best education for them. For some reason, they attack me for being, they'll say the tropes like, well, you guys are anti-public school. And I say to them back, why is it anti-public school when I say I want families to have an option when it comes to their education? In some ways they are admitting that, the product that these unions have been delivering really isn't the best product, right? Because if you're giving families a choice and they are saying, I don't want your option, and then thus they're saying, well, that we can't provide options because then they're not going to choose us. I mean, in some ways they're admitting, the failures that we've seen in the data. And so that's where, there's all these political factors, to your point, that I think are going to be really interesting to watch play out over the next, 5 or 6 months.
Right. And I guess for the educators as well, how inviting is this for them to continue a career in a brick and mortar type environment? And what will it look like for them, and how can they help?
Yeah, look, I think for educators, in some ways, someone can look at this pessimistically and say, well, if so many families are going into a homeschool environment, that's going to make, drastic changes to the teacher workforce. I think you can actually look at this pretty optimistically and say this could be the golden era for great educators, right? They may have, dozens of more opportunities to do education in ways that weren't in the, traditional sense. There might not be this whole, teach to the test mentality. There may not be this whole, 9 to 5 with the kids, or, whatever that, the exact system might be, plus, homework all night and grading papers all night. There may just be this whole new customizable learning environment. I even threw out there, what if, teachers are literally, helping the kids in their little neighborhood. I think you could just see hundreds of different models of education develop from this that allow for teachers, especially the really great ones, to thrive and to potentially even get paid more, because again, you're not paying for all these brick and mortar costs, or, administration, might finally be significantly reduced. Why do you need, 35 different, assistants to the, technology? All these things that you can just imagine and you see in these school budgets where you're going, why are we paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in many cases to people that aren't even in front of students and haven't been in front of students for, decades? I think that's where that whole model might start to shift. And you hear this from teachers where they say, look, I would love to continue teaching in the classroom. That's my passion. That's my love. But I can get paid more if I go into this kind of the district office and, be in administration. But they tell us too that, they don't feel the impact. They don't see the dramatic results, and they don't feel like they're even making a difference. But if the financial incentives from the districts or from the old model is such that that's where they have to go, I think, again, if we're reopening kind of new models, suddenly you can say, hey, you're a great teacher. You can stay here. You can get paid more. Families are eager to keep you in the game. I think all these things start to change. And I think, again, I'm optimistic and, perpetually optimistic, but I think this could really be a golden era for teachers.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I'm interested in your opinion for what do you think for other alternative education methods that will happen online during this time and maybe continue in the fall as an alternative for parents?
Right. No, I think while there has been just some chaotic factors of, parents, scrambling to find resources and, then there's almost been an overabundance of resources. And so, navigating that's, rather tricky. I think that there will be, especially if we continue this course with, schools being locked down potentially through the fall, or even just once things get back and, up and running, there's no doubt there's going to be a significant increase of families, pursuing home education. I think the more people that enter into that, so-called marketplace, the more options and opportunities that are going to be, created overnight. Even, friends that I know that work in, logistics or, things that are related to online commerce, they were making, sort of these assumptions that, well, in 10 years, XYZ is going to happen, suddenly in March. All those 10-year projections happen within, 3 months. I think a similar trend is going to happen within education to where, we've thought maybe at the end of the 2020s that there may be some more, better, more and better and different educational methods, different tutoring opportunities, different, opportunities for teachers and educators. I think so many of those trends are just going to be accelerated over the course of the next 6 months and even, through 2021. Again, but much of this relies upon political change and policy level change to where, policymakers have to sort of rejigger this system and make it more reactive to parents and more supportive of parents, and allowing funding to follow the parents so that they can pursue these different educational options. Because if we keep the system the same, the numbers are still going to be the overwhelming majority going to this brick and mortar in 20th 19th century model of education that I think we knew was outdated. And if you had a blank slate to say, okay, let's restart this education system and let's draw out how we want this to work for every kid, it would look nothing like what we had at least in early 2020. And I think that's where there's going to be this discussion of saying, look, we have to sort of redo things here in the future.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. And I think it's a really good time to see these different and customizable and personalized ways that students can thrive and learn in different environments. So that's a really exciting thing to come for the education world in that way. But I'm interested in what you think for some school districts that have decided not to return. How are parents reacting, and what's to come for these districts? And on the other side, I know there's a lot of uncertainty for those that haven't decided. So how can people navigate?
I think first, especially these school districts that in many ways have abandoned and abdicated responsibilities on this front. I think, we're seeing it, and I hear this both anecdotally and then in, reading in the newspapers. There's sort of these parent uprisings where they're furious, or they are now creating, separate, email threads and Facebook groups, of parents in various counties and districts saying, we need different options. This is unbelievable that, so many of us, and you especially, I think, hear this in these, you might call them wealthier districts, right? To where parents, through the price of their mortgage are paying essentially for a private school, right? Even though it's a public school. They're really furious at the quality of the product to say, wait a minute, we're paying all this in property taxes. We made, changes to our lives. They're finally furious enough about the model of education because they're seeing, my lights went out. Okay, you're recording again. So I think where, parents who, especially the ones who have been, paying high property taxes, they move to a new district for the better schools. So many of them are realizing, whether it's the price of their mortgage and whether it's their, the life choices they made or the sacrifices they made to get their kids into that so-called better school district, which then said, hey, we're not going to educate your kids in March. I think they're furious. And so many of them too are furious, as we've heard anecdotally, that when their kids have come home and they're really there, the parents are more, in the loop as to what's going on. So many of them have told us, my kids weren't really learning that much. I didn't realize how far behind they were. Or I didn't realize that, as first, second, third graders, really difficulties with reading and math that, seem pretty basic and where they, just far behind, which again, we've seen at the, the national level of all the data and statistics have borne this out. Parents are now getting that up close experience. So we've just seen so many of them, again, signing up for our website or, joining our lists on our various campaigns. And so many of them, just inbound, a lot more inbound to us saying, we want new options. They're citing our poll of saying, look, many other parents are in our camp that they're wanting to do homeschooling. We need to see some new options and opportunities. What can we do to fight for this change? I think that has suddenly really changed the whole political dynamic, because for so often and for many decades, and the groups that we've been serving, which are these lower income communities, they've been saying this for generations, that our schools, they're not right for our kids. They're unsafe. I mean, they've been failing academically for generations. Nothing's changed. We've been heard promises from politicians that, they'll fix it or they'll turn things around in 10 years. I mean, kids don't have time to wait for that, right? I mean, you only get one chance at your education. And so many of these changes that are promised, your kid might be out of school by then. And so what do you say to them? We've been seeing this with lower income families, and that's why we've been fighting so hard for them. But I think it's great in a lot of ways that many, you might call it middle income or upper income families, who have been, finally been getting engaged in this process of realizing, oh my goodness, these schools either, aren't meeting the standards that we thought they were meeting, or that they've been telling us that they're meeting, or two, the absolute just complete frustration of, wait, you're just not even going to do education when, we're spending, $15,000 per kid. They're like, well, we can't do remote learning because not everybody has a laptop or Wi-Fi. It's like, laptops and Wi-Fi, I mean, a few $100. And again, we're spending $15,000 per kid. I think you can make it work. So I think all of these, this bundle of frustration from all different, sectors of American life with, parents, I think this might be the real opportunity to finally make some significant changes, just because the political pressure is going to be overwhelming on these policymakers.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really been eye-opening for them to see this firsthand, like you said, and maybe they weren't prepared in March when this happened, but they can get prepared and provide these things, laptops or hotspots if they need, for the fall. But I'm also interested to know, how will this affect private schools? What do you think will happen for them?
So yeah, private schools, are in a tough spot, but they reacted really well to this crisis. So there was a study that came out right along when the first kind of initial data had been released, saying that, only 44% of school districts were, attempting to do remote learning or check-ins on students. Another study had just come out on I think about of 600 private schools, showing that, 80% of them, they didn't even miss, more than 5 days of instructional time. Because again, they have to serve their customers. Their tuition payers can vote with their feet and they can leave at any moment. So they understood, we have to react, we have to get things engaged. And we've just seen that but both in the data and from, the anecdotal experience in our networks of private schools, to where they did react quickly. They reacted well. But at the same time, parents are paying tuition at these schools. Even, the vast majority of, K through 8, K-12 schools, especially Catholic schools, it's pretty modest tuition. It's, $4,000 or $5,000 per year. Again, instead of setting, that next to the $15,000 per year we're setting in, spending in public schools, you really start to question things. But even at the same time, millions of these families come from, lower income environments, and they're going to private schools on scholarships, both privately funded scholarships or state funded scholarships, much like the ones that we try to pass into law. And if so many of them, with mounting job losses, financial difficulties, aren't able to pay tuition and just say, look, we have to put our kid into public school, or we have to put them into a home education environment. So many of these private schools have been relying upon the generosity of, donors to say, look, we believe in what you're doing, and we want you to help these lower income families. So many of them are at risk of closing just because families can't afford it. There's, a spike in demand for scholarship increases, or for scholarships for these families. But again, with job losses, market conditions, all this affects, the revenue coming in. So many of them are looking and making hard decisions. And if the last Great Recession, 2008, was any indication, I think the statistics showed that there was a dip in private school enrollment of about 400,000 across the country. I could only imagine, given, how this is just such a calamity compared to that, compared to that last recession, that, I mean, you might be expecting, 20% dips in enrollment. You might be expecting a similar number of school closures permanently, not just like COVID shutting down for the intermediate time period. We've already seen, I think at least as of this recording, something like 70 schools across the country have already announced that they're closing permanently. And most of these are serving these kind of lower income communities. I think and we're in the middle of summer. Every month that we get closer to school, they're going to know what's going on, or have at least an idea of, look, do the financials work out for our school? I mean, it's not like these schools were, really, bringing in tons of money or huge margins on their tuition. I mean, they're barely keeping things afloat. Even the educators that work there, they knew, and so many of them work on this as a mission, right? That they say, look, I could get paid more at a public school and get more benefits, but I believe in the mission of this school and I want to work there. For them too, they're wondering, am I going to have my job in the fall? So we've been advocating very heavily for, some immediate relief from the federal level, in these upcoming talks about, COVID relief. The public schools have requested $175 billion in relief, and we're saying, look, at least 10% of that, which is the proportional share of students that were in private schools, the kind of brick and mortar private schools, 10% of that needs to be, going towards private schools, and especially needs to be focused on, schools serving lower income families. Because if they close permanently, think of what havoc that's going to wreak on the budget systems of the states, right? Is suddenly, let's say 20%, 30% of private school students suddenly shift into a public school environment. I mean, that's going to be upwards of $15 to $30 billion in new state appropriations going to public education that wasn't there before, that was unaccounted for, coupled with, loss of tax revenues because, and then, unemployment benefits going out. I mean, that budget deficit just becomes, astronomical in so many ways. So for us, it's almost, penny spent, dollar saved sort of situation, where it's like, look, if you can provide direct relief to these schools, that's going to save you in the long run with your state budgets, in terms of kids shifting into the public school system. And and just from a kind of philosophical level, what a tragedy it would be with, if all these private schools that for generations and generations have really been a bedrock of many communities, these private schools have been, providing, a learning environment that, whether they are, Christian, Catholic, Jewish, et cetera, that have been for so many years providing an education that families have desired, right? It's a school of choice. They've chosen to go there for good reasons, whether that's not just great academics, but also for kind of character or religious formation that could also happen, that families really truly want with their child's education. That might be denied for millions of families in the future if, immediate relief isn't provided. So to me, this is the biggest crisis that private schools have ever faced. I can't really think of an example. I don't have all the data from the 1918 pandemic of what that looked like, but we've already seen a pretty steady decline in private school enrollment, partly because of these financial and economic issues. Families, they are getting a few more options, whether that's public charter schools or things like that. But it would be a real loss to this nation if we saw, this a mass wave of closures come the fall of private schools permanently, of which so many of them are serving lower income families. The ones that are, kind of on the wealthier end, they're going to be fine. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about schools that are, deep in the heart of these communities that have a mission of serving lower income families. If they close for good, I think, both on the budgetary level for, the states and the federal government, that's going to be a real massive spike. And then two, I think families, they're just going to be losing out on that education of their choice. And that goes to the fundamental, mission statement of what we're trying to do. We want all families to have the best education for their child. And just saying one option based upon your home address, that clearly hasn't been working. And it'd be a tragedy to see if that almost gets reinforced because of this crisis, because so many options have just been wiped out from the pandemic.
Wow, yeah, it's crazy. And I think it's really hard for so many to know exactly what will happen. So for our last question here today, after all of the amazing advice and expertise that you've shared with us, what advice can you give during this time of uncertainty? Maybe school districts in their communities haven't decided, or they have decided about reopening or moving into digital learning in the fall. What advice do you give for families who are out there trying to figure it out?
Well, my advice, frankly, would be, if you want a system of education that is more flexible, that will meet the needs of your kid, each individual kid, if you want a system that is going to be responsive to what you're seeking and to changes that you're seeking, I think they're starting to realize, families out there, that clearly the system that we have in place and the political structure that we have in place is not doing the job, and we need a new system. So I would say, join our movement. You can find us at federationforchildren.org. We're online on social media at School Choice Now, across Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Join our movement, because we're fighting for families. We're called the American Federation for Children for a good reason. Families have really never had any sort of organizing entity with the political structure and the policy know-how to really fight and give families more options until we had come along. And we think that the more families that can get engaged in this process, the more families that can apply that pressure to policymakers to say, you need to listen to us finally. Lower income families have been saying this for generations, because they've just seen, the bleak educational prospects that have been plaguing, their communities for so long. Now that all families have been forced into this environment of, a super restrictive homeschooling, Zoom schooling, whatever you want to call it. I think so many of them now, they finally have that political will, and they're finally seeing that they want more agency when it comes to their child's educational path. I am hopeful that, we can organize these families, direct them into the right, to the right causes, to make these policy changes that allow for, wouldn't it be nice if you got a portion of that $15,000 we're allocating to your kid? Wouldn't it be nice if you got some of that back to do some, home education, tutoring, therapies, any other sort of approved educational expense to customize the needs of your kid? Wouldn't it be nice if you got that? There are policy mechanisms that allow for that to happen. Wouldn't it be nice if you could, utilize some of that money that's being dedicated to your kid to go to that, lower cost private school that's just down the road that has been really successful? Wouldn't it be nice to have really true educational freedom to where all of these new learning methods and opportunities might thrive? And that's what we're fighting for every day, because it's just quite clear that, for millions and millions of families, that the current model of education was not serving them. I think millions and millions more are starting to realize it wasn't serving them either. So I am hopeful, and I am eager to really continue this fight. It's a tough one, just given the political forces and the billions of dollars and hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent, resisting all change to the system. I am hopeful that now, so many parents, they're going to rise up, so many families, they're going to really start to apply that pressure and that leverage to the political system to make these changes. I'm hopeful for the future, but we have a tight window, I think, over the next year or so to really get some of these things done. And so, join the team, join the movement. This movement for education freedom has been going on for so long, but now I think we've, in some ways, to use that cliche, I think we've reached a tipping point. So that's my advice to families in terms of advice for them with their education thing. I think it's safe to say, and this is the whole kind of philosophy of our movement, I don't know what works best for your kid, right? And I want you just to have the options to be able to choose what's best for your kid. Much like I might not know the exact, diet that's best for your kid, and to their individual needs and to their individual habits or their medical needs. And so we want to make sure you have every option available, and that's what we're fighting for. And we hope you join the team.
Yeah, and it's all for the kids. So thank you so much, Tommy, for your awesome advice and expertise today and joining us for this year's summit. If you wish to learn more about Tommy, you can follow him at American Federation for Children. Thank you so much.